Hello, everyone. Welcome to our July episode of Voices of WIA, brought to you by Women in Apologetics. WIA exists to equip women to deepen their faith in Christ by learning to defend it with confidence. Before we get started with our guest, who I'm very excited about, I have a few announcements from WIA. First of all, our most recent conference replay and others as well are now available by visiting our website, womeninapologetics.com. In addition, we have a National Nonprofit Day event called Lunchbox Live with Jade and Jeremy that includes a discussion on helping your kids prepare to go back to school. Trivia and prizes are included, and there's an opportunity for partnership with WIA. So we'd love for you to look for that, check that out. And finally, some of you may know that I serve as WIA's Islam Ministry Specialist, among other roles. And as part of that role, I helped produce a self-led course that we offer. It's called Islam Foundations. It is a 20-lesson course, pre-recorded lessons, about 20 to 25, 30 minutes per lesson. We have study guides. You have 1 year from the time of purchase to watch all of the videos. You can print out the study guides and keep them. I also did several interviews with other specialists in the field of Islam, former Muslims, scholars in Islam, people with master's degrees, PhDs, people with experience on the field who have been evangelists in various countries. And those are bonus interviews, and we're continuing to have more of those all the time. So if you have any interest in Islam, or actually, even if you don't think you will ever talk to a Muslim, I think it's well worth your time, because we do talk about a lot of the objections we hear from not only Muslims, but also a lot of times from atheists. And we talk about how we might respond to those objections. So check that out at womeninapologetics.com. Now I'd like to introduce our guest. Nancy Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity: How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. She's also written Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. And some of you may not know, she also co-authored a book called How Now Shall We Live with the late Chuck Colson. And that book was actually had a huge impact on me. Dr. Pearcey is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She's been quoted in The New Yorker and Newsweek. She's been highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today. And she is hailed in The Economist as, quote, America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Welcome, Professor Nancy Pearcey.
Thank you. It's good to be here. It's good to see you.
It's great to see you again. How long has it been? Maybe a year since we were in the manuscript. You were in the manuscript stage, and I had the privilege of taking a course with you.
Yes, I was going to make sure I mentioned that if you didn't, because you should all, everyone listening needs to know that Laura had a big part in finalizing the manuscript and making sure it was well balanced. And you had an enormous impact on the manuscript, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. It was a huge, huge privilege. I think I've told you before that How Now Shall We Live was, I believe it was the very first book I read after becoming a Christian at age 21. And it really had an enormous impact on me. I was introduced to the concept of evidence for Christianity. I was introduced to the idea of worldview and Christianity as a comprehensive worldview that applies to every area of life. And then, of course, total truth built on that foundation. And Love Thy Body is just so relevant for today. Every one of your books. I so appreciate all the work that you put into each and every thing that you write, and to all of your students. We all admire you greatly and appreciate you greatly at Women in Apologetics.
Well, thank you. And you guys are doing great work as well. I often get asked questions about why don't more women get involved in apologetics? And I always point them to your organization. And I said, well, we are getting there. And I find personally, I don't know about you, but I find personally a lot of times women are more likely to get involved when they have children, because when their kids start asking questions, they realize, okay, I've got to learn this stuff.
Right.
I may not have had questions, but my kids do. And so I have a responsibility to answer their questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, we do very much find that. Yeah. And I got really excited about apologetics when I started being challenged in the workplace by a non-Christian, but I would say the majority of our subscribers tend to take an interest in apologetics when they have children. So, well, let's get started with our discussion. I'm really excited to talk to you about this book. So let me start with this. People often accuse evangelical Christian men of being oppressive patriarchs, prone to abuse. But that's not what you found at all in a lot of your research. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so the accusations were very easy to find. When I went online and just Googled, I found lots and lots of people saying what you just said, that evangelical men are oppressive patriarchs. I'll just give you one quote. So this was by the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today.
Wow.
Pretty strong. And what happened, though, is that the social scientists were listening to this and they said, well, where's your evidence? You're making these accusations, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And what they found was the exact opposite. And I cite several studies, maybe a dozen different studies in my book, where they found that evangelical men who actually live it out, who actually attend church, who are sincere, test out as the most loving husbands and the most engaged fathers. And sometimes I get pushed back by people who say, well, of course their wives said that because they were sitting next to them. No, they interviewed the wives separately. So what they're reporting on is that the wives said that they were happiest with their husband's expressions of love and affection. These evangelical fathers tested out as the most engaged fathers, both in terms of shared time, like church youth group or sports, and in discipline in terms of setting limits on screen time and enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples had the lowest level of divorce of any major group in America. And then the real surprise, they have the lowest rate of domestic violence and abuse of any major group in America. And so when I read this, I was blown away. I mean, because I had not heard this, and I knew most people in the church have not heard this. I had to go digging into the academic literature to find this. And it was really the final reason I decided to write the book. I said, this needs to get out there. People in the church, first in the church, we need to be encouraging Christian men, because they're feeling beaten down by the culture as much as anyone else.
Absolutely.
In my class at Houston Christian University, when I told them I was writing a book on masculinity, a male student shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us."
Right.
So even Christian men feel that way. And then also, of course, it's a message we need to bring into the public arena to show why the secular mainstream media narrative is so wrong. It's so false. And we need to be bold in bringing it into the public square, because this is not just a pep talk, from a religious leader. This is solid social science data. This is evidence-based results. And so we should be bold in bringing it into the public arena as a form of cultural apologetics, defending Christianity in terms of defending the impact that it has on men. It does, in fact, reconcile the sexes, to use the subtitle of my book.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't think it should surprise anyone who has grown up in America or has been here for any length of time, that there is a difference between Christians who are committed followers of Jesus, who take it seriously, who have read the Bible, who know what Jesus taught, and who try to live it out, versus people who say they're a Christian because maybe they think it means, I'm a good person, or I haven't killed anybody, or I'm better than somebody out there, and that sort of thing. And that reflects what you found in your research as well.
Yes, because of course the first pushback you always get is, but wait a minute, don't Christians divorce at the same rate as everyone else? And in fact, in my research, I found that's one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders.
Right.
And so the researchers went back to the data, and they did separate out, the truly committed Christian men. And you can evaluate it by simply, how often do you actually go to church, for example, over against men who on a survey like this might check the Baptist box, for example, but who don't actually attend church very often, if at all.
Right.
And who are cultural Christians, because of their family background, or my husband's from Georgia, so I can say this, or they're from Georgia.
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly.
And they test out shockingly different. And this is amazing. Their wives test out as the least happy of even compared to secular men. They are the least engaged with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, higher than secular men. And the real shocker is they have the highest rate of domestic violence of any major group in America, higher than secular men. And so this is why the numbers get so skewed and so misleading, is because often a study might be done on evangelicals. So they'll get men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. And so, of course, the outcome is going to be misleading. And that's why none of us have ever heard about how well, committed Christian men are actually doing. And it does present a challenge, I think, to the church as well, because how can we now support and encourage men who are doing a good job? Right. One of my students who teaches, she's a women's ministry leader at a large Baptist church here in Houston. And she said, on Mother's Day, we tell women how wonderful they are and give out flowers. On Father's Day, we scold the men and say, do better.
Right.
And so this data helps us to change that message and say, men, you are doing a good job. This is hard social science data. You guys are doing great. Keep it up. But on the other hand, it also suggests we have a responsibility to reach out to these nominal Christian men, who are claiming the identity of evangelical. And in one sense, you might say they're ruining our reputation in the secular world, because, plenty of people meet those men as well. And we need to find a way to reach out to them. They're kind of at the fringes of the Christian world. So they're taking words like headship and submission, but they're not connected enough to the church to give it a biblical definition. And so they're importing secular definitions of control and dominance and coercion and so on into their definition of headship. Right. And so the church needs to reach out and make sure that we're finding ways to disciple these men.
Exactly. Yeah. It seems like a dangerous thing for someone to just hear that they're supposed to be the head, and then not to equip them with what that means. So let's move on to another question. You talk about how men are being torn between two competing scripts for masculinity. I really love those. I thought that was a significant distinction. What are those competing scripts for men?
Yeah, I'll give you the background to that too. This has turned out to be the most controversial book I've written, which surprised me because, Love Thy Body, my last book, dealt with abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, which is really the cutting edge issue today. But this has actually been more controversial. And, I had classes, like you were in one of my classes, and I did a lot of reading groups as well, to sort of rub off all the rough edges.
Right.
And when they would tell their family and friends that they were going through a manuscript on masculinity, invariably, the first question was, whose side is she on?
Right.
With that tone, whose side is she on? And then the next question was, and why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway? So
Yeah. Well, and the question I heard the most often was, is it all men's fault? Because this is from men, because I don't need it. I don't need another beatdown. So
yeah, oh, good. Okay, I'm going
that's
to
the
add that to
response
my
I heard.
notes.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the assumption is either men tended to assume I was a male bashing feminist, and my progressive students tended to think I was some sort of angry reactionary. And so I put this experiment right at the front because it kind of diffused that. This is a non-Christian sociologist, but he's very well known in his field. And so he gets invited to speak all around the world. And he came up with this very clever experiment where he asked young men 2 questions. First, he would ask them, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And he said, all around the world, young men had no trouble answering that. They would say things like honor, duty, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, be a provider, be a protector, be responsible, be generous. And he found the same answers from Brazil to Sweden to Australia. And he would say, where did you learn that? And they say, well, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western country, they would say, it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would follow up with the second question. He'd say, well, but what does it mean if I say, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, no, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, be competitive.
Right.
Yes. Be stoic. Get rich, get laid. I'm using their language.
Right.
And so this was amazing. The conclusion from that is men are made in God's image, and they do know what the good man is. They innately know what it means to be a good man. Romans 2, right? We all have a conscience. We know right and wrong. But around the world, men also feel a cultural pressure to live up to the real man. And the real man, those traits tend to be what people consider more toxic, especially if they're separated from the moral ideal of the good man. They can easily slide into dominance and exploitation and oppression and so on. And so what this does, though, is I think it gives us a better strategy for dealing with these issues. Instead of calling men toxic, which doesn't usually work, it wouldn't work with anybody.
Right.
We should try to affirm and encourage and support their innate knowledge of what it means to be a good man. And it gives us a much more positive strategy for dealing with these issues.
Right, exactly. So men are falling behind in education, in employment, in health and life expectancy. This is sure to continue to have enormous effects on our society and culture. Not only is that bad for men, but it's bad for everyone when men in a culture don't thrive. Why do you think people are ignoring the real problems men face today? And what do you think the outcomes will be if we don't reverse course?
Yes. Well, first of all, I agree with you. Boys are falling behind at all levels of education, from kindergarten to college. And even at graduate school, more women than men now are graduating from graduate school and even professional schools like law and medicine. And once they are adults, they're falling behind, both relative to women and relative to where men were in the past. So that men are more likely to commit suicide, to be addicted to drugs and alcohol, to be homeless, to commit crime. 90% of people in prison are male. And right now, male unemployment has dropped to Depression-era levels. This was really stunning. It's not showing up in the statistics because they're not even looking for work anymore. So researchers had to dig deeper and find that unemployment among men is at Depression-era levels. And their life expectancy is going down. Women's is staying the same, so it's not a general trend. It's just male life expectancy is going down. So there's a magazine called The New Scientist, and it said the major demographic factor now in early death is being male.
Wow.
So I think it's time for us to start asking the question you asked: how can we support men? We should have some compassion for men. And why, you asked, why why haven't we done more? Well, the first book that really dealt with this was Christina Hoff Sommer's book, The War Against Boys.
Yes, I've read that. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I figured you would have. and she said, well, frankly, feminist groups oppose everything we try to do. If we try to have more male-friendly curricula for school, they worked very hard to get girl-friendly, girl-supportive curricula in school, which is great. But now it's time to start thinking about what can we do to help boys succeed better in school. Mm-hmm. Or the feedback I often got is, I'll just quote you, one of my students. She said, it seems like men still end up in the top echelons of power, the CEOs, the presidents, the Hollywood film producers, and so on, Fortune 500 companies. And so she said, we always kind of assumed that men were okay, that they don't need any help. And then she realized, actually, on average, men are not doing okay. They are doing worse. So maybe the 5% or so of men who are at the very top, but we're ignoring the fact that on average, men are actually doing worse today. And it is time, I would say it's time for us to look at measures that might help boys and men. I'll give you one example of the opposition. So there's a White House Council on Girls and Women. So there were groups who tried to get let's have a White House Council on Men and Boys. They tried for years. They've never succeeded. That would be an example.
Wow. And young women have, and girls and people with daughters have a vested interest in seeing boys and men do well. I hear this all the time from different social media platforms that women are making these videos saying, okay, so I just need a man who has a better education than I do, who has a higher salary than I do, who is as healthy as I am, who has achieved more. He needs to at least be at my level, as they say. And they're like, so where are they? I can't find these men anywhere. And you find out about the women, and they have graduate degrees. They've been focusing on their careers for 15 years or so. Now they're ready to settle down and get married. They've been very, very successful. They did great in school, and now they want a man who is what they would say at their level. And they're wondering why there's a shortage of that. But we've worked so hard to kind of raise up women that now, like you said, I mean, when men are starting to get lost in that, and we're starting to see, we've actually been seeing this for quite some time now, that women are outperforming men in so many different areas. I think if these young women, want to be getting married and things like that, we need to figure out how we can encourage, lift up men, equip them with what they need, and not be always tearing them down. So.
Yeah, in other words, we should value the distinctively masculine traits and strengths. Instead of trying to suppress it, we need to learn how to channel it in honorable and productive ways. And I think a lot of in my book, of course, people's first question was, well, what do you think are the differences between men and women? And, the most non-controversial place to start is pure biology. Men are bigger, stronger, faster. They, because of testosterone, they do tend to be more aggressive and risk-taking. And every culture has acknowledged that men have a distinctive role because of that. I'll give you another study. This was by an anthropologist named David Gilmore. He did the first ever cross-cultural study of concepts of masculinity. And what he found is that no matter what the culture said in terms of, how they define masculinity, sometimes more aggressive, sometimes more peaceful, whatever, all cultures said that to be a real man is to fulfill what he called the 3 Ps. The 3 Ps: provide, protect, and procreate. In other words, raise a family, build the next generation. And that was another example where men universally had an understanding that their unique masculine strengths are not given them to get whatever they want, but to love, support, and care for the people who are dear to them, to their family, to the wives and children, and their community. This is a universal, universal insight that men have. And again, if we can focus on what their innate knowledge of what it means to be a man made in God's image, I think we'll be much more successful in encouraging them.
Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, I kind of smiled when you said, the most obvious and basic place to start is biology. And it grieves me that even that is being challenged today. And I meet so many young women and have conversations with them, and they will actually dispute that men are generally stronger and faster and things like that. And they'll say, no, I mean, women can be better than men in any sport. And in fact, they would be if they competed together. And women can be fighters and take down men in fights. And I'm thinking, like, what movies are you getting this from?
That's right.
I grew up playing competitive tennis, and I was friends with a few of the top 10 female players in the world. And I was friends with several men ranked in the thousands in the world in men's tennis. And the men ranked in the thousands would regularly and easily defeat Martina Navratilova when she was number one in the world. Yeah. There is a very clear difference. That's just one example, but
yes. And let me jump in on that one though, because there's a book by a former liberal feminist. Her name is Louise Perry. Have you seen her book? It's called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution.
No.
It's very good. She's British.
Okay.
But she was well known as a very liberal, left-leaning journalist, and okay. she was probably the type who would have said, "Yeah, if women would just work out, they'd be as strong as men too," until she worked at a rape shelter. And yeah. When she worked with real-life cases where a woman is alone with a man and they're maybe both half drunk, that difference in strength is all the difference between getting raped or not. Mm-hmm. And that was like the scales fell from her eyes. And yep. She's become very conservative on many issues now. But I thought that was a good point, because you can say, oh, yeah, if women would just work out, they'd be as strong as men. And I've heard that too. Mm-hmm. But wait until you're in a situation. Mm-hmm. In my book, I have 2 chapters on domestic violence, because what we said earlier, that nominal evangelical men tend to be the most violent. My favorite sociologist on this, by the way, is Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia.
Right.
And he wrote an article in Christianity Today where he literally said, the most violent men in America are nominal Protestant evangelicals. Mm-hmm. So, of course, I had to deal with that in the book. Otherwise, it would look like I was sweeping it under the carpet. Mm-hmm. So I have 2 chapters on domestic violence. And I have to tell you, Laura, I even became more conservative when I was doing the research on that. Mm-hmm. Because I faced firsthand, look at these situations where the man is using his strength. He does have mm-hmm. more strength, and he's misusing it. He's mm-hmm. using it to harm. Right. And it really persuaded me, we need to acknowledge men's greater strength, or we will not put moral restraints on it. If you don't acknowledge it, you won't say, okay, men, you've got to use your strength in positive ways. Mm-hmm. You have to acknowledge your strength in order to say that. All those, I love all the proverbs about, a man, it's more honorable to conquer yourself than to conquer a city. Mm-hmm. Yep. Those kind of verses. Those are the verses we need to be using with men, that yes, you have greater strength, but you need to take pride in controlling that strength for the sake of the people around you, the people that you love.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I did CrossFit for a long time, and now I'm doing Taekwondo, and I can tell you, anyone who thinks that, just come on and join me for a workout sometime with the men that I work out with. It takes, if a man hasn't worked out in 30, 40 years, it takes him about a week to catch up to my strength. So, but we have to, let's take a break from our questions for a moment and do the book giveaway. I am very excited about this book. This is my copy, The Toxic War on Masculinity, which is available on Amazon and I think anywhere you can find books. I got my copy on Amazon.com. And we have a winner. And our winner this evening is Miss Carly Jacobowski. Congratulations, Carly. I promise I had absolutely nothing to do with that. Carly is a friend of mine, and I had nothing to do with that. Congratulations, Carly. That's you're going to love this book. I can't wait to talk to you about it. That is awesome. All right. So let's carry on with our conversation. So let's see. I have so many questions for you. I would love to talk to you for hours. But let me ask you this. Your book says that criticisms of men began much earlier than most of us think. And the history in your book is phenomenal. I absolutely love the history book. It was probably the history part and the sociology parts were probably my favorites. Can you give us a very brief explanation of where the idea of toxic masculinity came from?
Yeah, because most people presume maybe it was the 1960s, second wave feminism. And I was surprised to find out that you have to go much further back in history. You have to go back to the Industrial Revolution. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, men worked side by side with their wives and their children all day, right? So the caretaking ethos was what was most expected of men. They had to be kind and gentle. They're working with their kids. They're training their kids in the adult skills. And so the idea was that men did not just look out for their own interests. They looked out for the interests of the whole of the family. In fact, that was the definition of authority back then. Authority had a very specific definition. It meant that you were not supposed to look out for your own interest. In other words, I look out for my interest, you look out for your interest, but who looks out for the interest of the marriage, the family, the church, the school, civil society, and so on. And that's what the position of authority was for. In fact, the favorite word of that time was you were supposed to be disinterested, meaning if you were an authority, you didn't look out for your own interest. Your job was to look out for the interest of the whole social institution. People tell me, hey, if people still had that definition, we wouldn't mind it so much. And so how did we lose that? The Industrial Revolution changed everything because it took work out of the home. So, of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, men were not working with people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And so the ethos began to change at that point. And you see it reflected in the literature of the time. People began to complain that men were losing that caretaking ethos that they'd had in the colonial period. And that they were becoming self-interested, egotistical, aggressive, ambitious, look out for number one, make it, all of those accusations show up in the 19th century already. So if you want to see where did the language describing the male character start to go negative, you have to go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, which of course also kind of suggests what the solution is. The solution is how can we find ways to reconnect men even after the Industrial Revolution? Can we find ways to reconnect men to their families? Can we find ways to flex the workplace somewhat in order for them to have more time with their families again? And I have a whole chapter on that. You have to have some practical suggestions on how to maybe work a couple days a week from home or do more telecommuting and so on. And actually, that's kind of the very small silver lining of the pandemic was that a lot of people discovered they do like working from home and being closer to their family. One survey, 65% of fathers said they did not want to go back to the workplace full time after the pandemic.
Yeah.
The New York Times had a wonderful, that one's in the book. This one came out after the book, but the New York Times had a really wonderful article titled, "During the Pandemic, Fathers got closer to their children and they don't want to lose that."
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so it's the pandemic that did help open people's minds to the possibility of working, both men and women, being able to integrate work and family better than than in the past. And it also opened the eyes of CEOs. They have to be open to it too.
Mhm.
And so in my book, I quote CEOs saying, we were afraid to let people work from home because the productivity would go down. The pandemic exploded that fear. We did not see any productivity go down. If anything, it went up because people weren't wasting time commuting and in unnecessary meetings and so
Right.
on.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's a win-win, in other words.
Right. Yeah. And I think I mentioned this to you before, but it's interesting to me that to read the history of families working together and such out of the home, which of course, in some way, I knew that from studying history, but it was interesting to me because I've had so many conversations with leaders of Christian ministries who have been presented with requests from men to work from home when the role allowed for it, and leaders have said no, because that's not in our DNA, and we don't go off and do new and different strange things. Like, we stick with what we know works and what conservatives have always done, and that sort of thing. And I'm thinking now, as I was reading your book, I was like, that phrase was ringing in my mind. We do what we've always done, what we know has worked, what has always been done. And I'm thinking that you only think that's what's always been done because you were in college in the 1970s. That's not what has always. Go a little bit further back and see what had been done then.
For millennia, for most of human history. I mean, the Industrial
Mhm.
Revolution was the 19th century. Roughly 1750 to 1850. So for millennia, families have worked the family farm, the family industry, the family business, where both men and women were able to do economically productive work while raising their children. There wasn't that gap between family and work. And so it was better for women too, because women were able to exercise their gifts. The Proverbs,
Right.
Proverbs 31 woman, right, who has all kinds of businesses that she runs out of her home. Well, that was pretty much the common thing before the Industrial Revolution. Women could be involved in very interesting, challenging work while raising their children. So it was both men and women benefited from that greater integration of life and work.
Yeah, absolutely. And the book goes into a lot more detail on that. It's absolutely fascinating. I strongly recommend people get the book, read the whole thing, but that section again is just invaluable. So today's public rhetoric often casts men as villains and women as victims. Where did these stereotypes come from?
So that was the Industrial Revolution as well.
Mhm.
So as men left the home for work, at the same time, society was secularizing. After the Industrial Revolution, there arose a large public sphere of families, factories, industries, commerce, universities, the state, and so on, financial institutions. And people began to say, well, these large public institutions should be run by scientific principles, by which they meant value free. In other words, don't bring your private values into the public square, which is what we still hear today.
Right.
And since it was men working in that public square, that secularized public square, and getting that secularized education, they became secular earlier than women did. And again, you see this reflected in the literature of the time. People began to be very concerned that men were no longer living their lives by a biblical ethic. They no longer had a biblical understanding of manhood, that they were not going to church as often, that they were starting to, well, at first they tried to have sort of a sacred secular split. Okay, we'll function by secular principles in the workplace, and then when we come home, then we become nice Christian gentlemen again. But of course, over time, and their behavior became worse. In the 19th century, drinking, gambling, gang activity, prostitution, all exploded. Sometimes it's easier if you have a single fact to hang it on. So 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today.
Wow.
So there's a reason there was a temperance movement. And
Right.
yeah, it's kind, and public drunkenness was a big problem, kind of like, alcoholics and drug addicts, filling the streets of San Francisco today. It was somewhat similar. At any rate, so women, if values were kicked out of the public square, where would they be cultivated? Well, in the private sphere. Well, women were in the private sphere. And so for the first time ever in human history, women were said to be the moral guardians of society. I want you to see how unusual this was.
Right.
All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, people had thought that the insight into right and wrong was a rational insight, and they thought men were more rational. Therefore, men were thought to be more virtuous. In fact, the word virtue, the root of the word vir, is Latin for man. It means, as in the word virile.
Virile, right, right.
So virtue had connotations of masculine strength and honor. And for the first time ever in the 19th century, people began to say, oh, well, it's women who are morally superior to men, because now the values and religion were cultivated, and spirituality were all cultivated in the home. And women were said to be the ones who, were responsible for that. So many of the reform movements against gambling and prostitution and drinking and slavery were run by women. They said, well, if we're responsible for the moral tone of society, we need to go out and start all these reform movements. So there was a huge flowering of reform movements also in the 19th century, mostly motivated by women. So we had sort of a conflict, therefore, between men and women. Women were saying, they were essentially jumping on men for their because men's behavior was growing worse. One of my favorite historians puts it this way. It's a clever phrase. She says, there was little doubt as to the sex of the tavern keepers, the slaveholders, the seducers, and the drunkards. In other words, you don't always read this in the textbooks when they talk about the reform movements, but it was definitely a male-female opposition. So, and I think we still have that double standard today, that we still tend to think that women are the ones who are the ones who are the moral gatekeepers, in a sense. When you talk to young people today, I just had an interview, by the way, with a very young couple. And they loved talking about this, because they said, absolutely, in the dating scene, in the Christian dating scene, it is assumed that men are just naturally more lewd and rude and crude, and they're always going to push the sexual boundaries, and it's up to women to hold the line and be the gatekeepers. I thought, well, ever since the 19th century, we're seeing the impact of that even still today.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, and it sets up the sexes to kind of be against each other. That's just, yeah. So, so I recall reading in Total Truth, you talked a bit about Darwinism and how a lot of Christians just kind of acquiesced to that and didn't really necessarily study the science themselves, and just thought, well, we'll just give this little thing to the secularists. We'll just go ahead and not make a big deal out of Darwinian evolution as the source of our existence and all that is. And we won't fight that battle. We don't know how necessarily. It's science can be hard for whatever reasons. A lot of Christians just kind of acquiesce at that theory, and it seems like over and over and over today, now we are seeing more and more dangerous results from that, destructive, that's the word, results from an embracing of the theory of evolution, of macroevolution. So this is an area, this idea of masculinity, toxic masculinity, and all of that, that I believe, and you talked about in your book, the theory of evolution from Darwin also kind of impacted. So you talk about how Darwinism normalized many traits in men that today are labeled toxic. Can you tell us how so?
Yeah, so you don't often hear this in books critiquing Darwinism. You don't hear this side of it very often. But yes, the Darwinian thinkers had a huge impact on the definition of masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
What they argued was the men who came out on top in the struggle for survival would by necessity be ruthless, rugged, brutal, savage, barbarian, and even predatory. So
Wow.
the idea, therefore, was that to recover your manhood, you need to get in touch with the animal core of your nature, the beast within. This is when the Tarzan books became popular, by the way. There's a huge, I don't know if you realize, it's a huge series, about 50 books. And he was intentionally trying to portray a Darwinian view. His son says so. I have a quote from his son where he says, we wrote these books because we were trying to figure out how to adjust to the notion that humans are just part of the animal world. This was a new concept. And so, so Tarzan, because he's raised by the apes, retains that inner core of wildness, even after he learns European languages and customs. He turns to Jane and he says, "I'm still a wild beast at heart." Mm-hmm. And there was more that's popular literature. There was a more serious form of literature called literary naturalism. Mm-hmm. And again, they were intentionally using their fiction to communicate a Darwinian worldview. The best known is Jack London, and mm-hmm. He became a Darwinist as a young man. One historian puts it this way: when he read Darwinian literature, he experienced a conversion experience to radical naturalism or materialism. Mm-hmm. He used to memorize passages from Charles Darwin as if they were scripture.
Wow.
So even though, he talked about dogs, they were metaphors for humans. And his whole point was that humans are merely products of environment with no free will, animals at the core. So what happened then is, instead of urging men to live up to the image of God in them, the Darwinian thinkers said, no, we need to live down to the animal core. That's our true nature. Mm-hmm. Masculinity was redefined as crude and combative and governed by the impulses for lust and power. And by the way, and you might ask, how did women get along with such brutal men? And Herbert Spencer, who was the main popularizer of Darwinism here in America, addressed that issue. And what he said was, well, women had to learn the ability to please. And it would also help if they learned how to hide their resentment at such poor treatment.
Oh my goodness.
So that was a message of evolution, apparently. And I should add that Darwin also argued explicitly that women are intellectually inferior to men. So mm-hmm. that also contributed to toxic masculinity, mm-hmm. because he said that men are intellectually superior, and he acknowledged that women are more sensitive and intuitive. And then he said, but those are characteristics of the lower species. Wow. So even what he thought, even their positive characteristics were signs of their inferiority. And Thomas Huxley, who you probably know, Darwin's bulldog.
Yes.
Even Thomas Huxley said, since women's intellectual inferiority is a product of natural selection, it cannot be fixed even by a program of educational selection. In other words, we can't give her enough education to pull her out of her inferiority. Wow. So this was a huge part of the secularization of the script for masculinity. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the traits, as you said, a lot of the traits we consider toxic came from this. And in my book, I don't just talk about Darwin, I talk about how his ideas have been revived today under the label of evolutionary psychology. So mm-hmm. there's still prominent thinkers, best-selling books out there saying that men are just naturally rude and crude and violent and uncivilized, and it's up to women to civilize them. So that message is still out there.
Right. Yeah. Well, you again, like you said, you go into more detail in the book as well, and you also talk about how secularization contributes to a negative script for masculinity. You talk about some really valuable ideas for how we can look at reversing this trend. You talk about ideas for how fathers can take steps to be more involved with their children, their sons and their daughters as well. And as you mentioned as well, you also have a couple of chapters on abuse and that sort of thing. So I want to encourage everyone again to get this book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. And at this time, just for a few minutes, we're going to go to a couple of questions from the live chat. So we have a question here. I would love for Nancy to unpack the definitions of complementarian and egalitarian.
Yeah. So what's been kind of fascinating about the book is that I don't even deal with that. I don't even deal with that, and yet it's everybody's question. It's everybody's question. So I'll give some background. I'll tell you why I don't deal with it. I do explain that in the book. Two of the top marriage researchers in America both agree that a man's gender theory, namely complementarian, egalitarian, is not really the defining factor in whether he has a good marriage. So I'll tell you who I quote. I quote Brad Wilcox, who I mentioned already. He's one of the top marriage researchers in America. And the second one is John Gottman. He's a psychologist. Mm-hmm. By the way, Wilcox is Catholic. Gottman is kind of secular Jewish. And both of them say that in their research, here's how John Gottman puts it. In my practice, I get men who think they should be in charge of their marriage and therefore of their wife. And I get people who are very egalitarian. And you know what? Here's how he puts it. Emotionally intelligent husbands have figured out the most important thing, which is how to convey honor and respect to your wife. He says, I just don't see a difference based on their gender theory. And Brad Wilcox said the same thing. He said, I'm not finding that complementarian marriages end up being tyrannical and abusive. But he also did at least one study on egalitarian marriages. And he said, they're not any happier. He expected that. I mean, the feminists have led us to expect that, of course, they're going to be happier, that equal power sharing and no form of authority or hierarchy is obviously going to be a happier marriage. And they just didn't find that. I say they because he did it. This particular study was done with some of his colleagues. They did not find that egalitarian marriages were any happier. So I explain in my book, that's why I'm not going to really get into this issue, because it doesn't seem to make much difference. What makes the biggest difference positively is just that the man values his family, that he thinks of family as being the central social institution of society. It's the foundation of society. He's committed to his marriage. He's committed to his family. It's his number one priority. And men who put their family first end up having good marriages. And the other reason I don't deal with it, by the way, is because that's not what they studied. My book is, like you said earlier, it's got historical facts. It's got his sociological facts. The sociologists didn't go out to study complementarian versus egalitarian, except in the few examples I just gave you. Mm-hmm. For the most part, they went out to study evangelicals, because the secular world was criticizing evangelicals, right? The secular world was saying evangelical men are going to be harsh and abusive and tyrannical, and so they went out to study evangelicals. And so I'm reporting the facts. I'm not reporting my own opinions. This is not my own theological discussion of gender theory. I'm reporting what they actually found. And the reason I found that so interesting is because the secular world says evangelical men are going to be abusive and bad. And so I went and said, well, are they? And the answer is no, they're not. And you can't argue with the facts. The facts are that evangelical men who are committed to their faith are in fact the most loving and the most engaged. In fact, let me give you a quote. It's fun to sometimes have a specific quote.
Sure, sounds good.
So this is from the New York Times. So to give you a sense of when I said Brad Wilcox was one of the most prominent marriage researchers in the country, he gets published in places like the New York Times.
Right.
And so this was from a New York Times article that he wrote. He said, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. So they're looking specifically at the wives, right? Because the assumption is it's the wives who are being oppressed.
Right.
The happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And then this is actually my favorite part. He turns to his secular colleagues, because he's at the University of Virginia, and he says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices about religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. So again, the bottom line is Christians have a practical answer to reconciling the sexes, and it's one that stood up to rigorous empirical testing, and that's why we should be bringing this message out into the public arena.
Yeah, and I think the concept of that you mentioned of men putting their families first and seeing that as their primary ministry and loving their families well at the expense of other priorities is actually really radical in today's culture as far as the circles I've been in. That right there would just be such a mind-blowing concept to a lot of the men I've known in ministry who genuinely, wholeheartedly believe that God is most pleased with them when they achieve the most in their career, and their family suffering is just the sacrifice you make for being a Christian. Their children's suffering is just the price they pay, and that sort of thing. So I think this is I don't know about the the circles that you tend to be in, but I can just tell you, having been in ministry for 25, 30 years, that idea of putting your family first is radical in a lot of Christian ministry and missions circles. So I think that's another reason this is a very important book.
I do have a section where I talk about how men benefit from becoming more involved fathers, because, we always talk about how their family's going to benefit, but I don't mind appealing to self-interest. So I have a section on how again, it's the social sciences. The studies have been done where they find that men are much happier when they're deeply involved in, loving close relationships with their children and their wives. And they men who were surveyed in these studies said things like how their life was so much richer and their sense of masculinity was enhanced. We've kind of lost the idea that being a father is a very important part of your sense of manhood. And this was fascinating. Some of the most recent stuff is, we all know that when women give birth, their oxytocin goes up, and oxytocin is the bonding hormone. Creates a sense of attachment. But they're now testing men, and men also have oxytocin rise when their wife gives birth to a baby. They have to be holding and touching their baby. It's stimulated by touch. It's tactile. But men's oxytocin goes up too, so they also feel a greater sense of attachment and closeness with their children when they're actively holding and caring for their children. And here was the most recent research, and the most surprising research, is that the men's oxytocin goes up even during his wife's pregnancy. If a man is living with his wife during the pregnancy, his oxytocin is actually going up during the course of her pregnancy, so that God is biochemically preparing men to be totally involved, in the parenting team. God is biochemically preparing them. I thought this was so cool. Apparently, nobody ever thought to test a man's blood during his wife's pregnancy.
Right. Understandably, it wouldn't occur to me.
And yes, and so that's the most recent finding. It's by an anthropologist called.
Wow.
It's in a book called The Life of Dad. But anyway, it's fascinating that men too report that when, in fact, one psychologist calls it the dad brain. There is a nest of neurons that get activated when you become a father. And if you don't become a father, they don't get activated. Maybe you can be a substitute father. I don't want to rule out single men. They can have father-like relationships as well.
Sure.
But if you're not actively involved in fathering, you have a dad brain. and men who are actively involved will, in these studies, would say, I could feel it. I could feel my brain just going off as I carried my baby. As I carried my baby from the operating room or the delivery room, I guess. It was fascinating that these people who were interviewed would talk about how much they benefited. And so I put that in because I don't just want scolding, men, you need to do better.
Right.
I want them to feel like, hey, I actually benefit as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. I would love, as I said before, I wish we could just go for hours, and maybe sometime in the future we could have you back for some more conversation. But in the meantime, I would like to, again, just encourage people to go to Amazon.com, Christianbook.com, wherever you buy books, and get The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes by Nancy Pearcey. And we want to thank you all so much for joining us. Be sure to check out Women in Apologetics on Facebook, Instagram, and I'm pretty sure we're on another one that I'm forgetting. I'm going to get in trouble for not knowing that later. Facebook and Instagram for sure. And also join us next month. We will have another guest for our monthly Voices of WIA. Our next guest has a fascinating background, fascinating story to tell, is very knowledgeable on her topic. We'll be sharing some more information about that later. But again, The Toxic War on Masculinity by Nancy Pearcey. Go ahead and get that book. Follow Women in Apologetics on social media, and we will see you next time. Thank you.